Good afternoon, friends. Today is Wednesday, June 3rd, the Wednesday after Pentecost. Pentecost Day, so let's hear this part of today's first reading from the second letter of St. Paul to Timothy. For this reason, I remind you to stir into flame the gift of God that you have through the imposition of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather of power and love and self-control. So do not be ashamed of your testimony to our Lord, nor of me, a prisoner for his sake. But bear your share of hardship for the gospel with the strength that comes from God. Needless to say, it's been a difficult week. It's been a difficult week here on the north side, which you're well aware. Weekend days, of course, unlike any of us have known. So forgive me if I'm a little scattered in my reflections on racism for this week, because there's just so many conversations that I've had and so much information and so many experiences that of course don't result in coming to clear conclusions, but only raise more questions and more stirrings and more wonderings and more lack of clarity and lots of different feelings. I was on yesterday. I was on an interfaith march with clergy of all faiths in South Minneapolis to the site where George Floyd was killed, and it was a powerful experience. It was a remarkable experience to be with not only other clergy, but clergy from just spanning every spectrum of color and culture and denomination and persuasion and conservative, liberal, you name it. People were there to stand with one another, as a sign that we were going to be together and getting through this. It was a very solemn walk. It was silent for the most part. And there were some prayers, simple prayers at the place at 38th in Chicago, which has kind of become a memorial, of course, to George Floyd. I hope too it's a signal going forward that we're going to be working across such broad boundaries of race and religion to come together to effect some positive change. And I know we start small. It's, we're asking a question, how do we at Ascension, what are we going to do to make change happen? Or, I'm in conversation with a group of priests who are asking that. And of course the diocese will be working at, say, how is the Archdiocese working towards some systemic change? We all have to clean up our acts in our homes. But there's such power of looking kind of beyond ourselves as well to, what do my Muslim brothers and sisters how are we going to be working together with them to move toward change? This is so big a matter that it's not just going to be solved at home, if you will, but across those boundaries. So I hope that that experience I had yesterday translates into working together as an interfaith body as we go forward. It was also a great experience for me. It was in the neighborhood of my high school. I went to Minneapolis Central High School, which is no longer there, but which was on 34th and 4th Avenue South, just a few blocks from where we were. And I had all sorts of memories of hanging out in that neighborhood as we walked it and as we drove through it to get home. And it's not unrelated to the events of, or my own reflections on racism this week, personal reflections, because my going to Central was a huge turning point in my life. I was raised, as you know, in North Minneapolis, or you may not know, I was raised in North Minneapolis on 46th and DuPont in a very white neighborhood. There were black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods on the north side in those days, and I was in a white neighborhood. And generally speaking, not a white enclave, a white bubble. My going to Central, I transferred to Central my junior year in high school. I had been a student at Grace High School, which is then Archbishop Grace or Bishop Grace High School in Fridley. And generally a very positive experience for me, but Central, I had gotten to know I did know the music director there. We had worked together. I had gotten to meet some students who went to Central. And Central was a magnet school, which meant that even though I lived in North Minneapolis, I could transfer to South Minneapolis because they offered special programs in English and music and humanities, other subjects. And so it was, I was just kind of itching for a change. Central at that time was very racially mixed. It was probably half white, half black. In the heart of South Minneapolis, very different culture than Grace High School at that time in Fridley. I think we had two black students. I'm sure a handful of Latino students. Otherwise, again, a very white cultural experience. So Central offered this kind of exotic, move to a culture and a world very different than what I had known. And so I went to Central, and I loved it. It was kind of wild and woolly, and and again, students of all sorts of persuasions mixed, because it was not only white and black students, but as I said, because it was a magnet school, a lot of those students came from neighborhoods other than South Minneapolis. As I did, I came from North Minneapolis. Others may have come from other neighborhoods in South or Southwest Minneapolis. But it was the turning point in my life with regard to being part of a much more diverse mix of people. And so whatever insulation I had kind of experienced was broken down, and got to appreciate and know and enjoy people whose life experience was very different than my own. And as high school students, of course, then we didn't, how to say it, we didn't explore, the effects of racism and living in, a racist world and society. We were just there, and we all got along for the most part. I mean, there were uh, uprisings now and then. This wasn't the most difficult days of racial unrest in in the Twin Cities. This was the mid '70s, and so it was relatively calm. But we all just got along, and we were who we were, and we were different from each other. And some people we liked, and some people we didn't. And for the most part, I suppose, hung out with our white friends or our black friends. But um, there was some there was some overlap as well. Um, the real questions, and most of us, you know, would do well in that kind of, of climate. I would guess. We all get along, but of course, the events of this past week remind me that there are much bigger issues, we need to dig much deeper into what racism is. Especially as white people, we can be very defensive because we like people. We like people of different colors. We get along. We have nothing against them. But until we're able to look at kind of the system of racism in our society, or the structure of racism, not much will change in terms of, for example, Minneapolis, of all places in the country, is, some of the worst disparities in housing, in income, in employment, in education. We hear often, because we work so hard at Ascension to work for equity in offering quality education to people who otherwise might not, for whom it might be difficult to achieve or to have. Minnesota ranks 50th in high school graduation between disparities between children of color and white children. So what is it? What is it that keeps people of color kind of below a certain level and keeps us, who are not people of color, above a certain level? And what in our society needs to change, not only in attitude, but what policies, what systems need to change in order to make it possible for that inequity to somehow be adjusted? These are not easy questions, obviously. And what's remarkable about this time is that not only are we here at Ascension thinking and talking about it, but The city, the state, the country, the world is talking about it. That video got our attention. I want to. There was an article in the National Catholic Reporter this past week by Father Brian Massengale, who is a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Writes and speaks frequently and has written about race. He's an African American man, but he kind of unpacked this very interesting experience or incident in New York City, which I want to call your attention to. I don't have the name of the title of that article with me, but I think it was dated June 1st. It's in the National Catholic Reporter. You can go online. Father Brian Massengale, and I've quoted him before. But he talks about the case of Amy Cooper in New York City, who is a woman. This is another video which went viral. She was walking her dog in a place in Central Park, which was kind of a preserve, a bird watching area. And a man asked her she had a dog who was not on the leash. The dog was supposed to be leashed. The man asked her to put the dog on, or asked her if she would put the dog on a leash. And she didn't like that. The man was African American. So, and he was videotaping the situation. Got to a point where she said, I'm going to call the police and tell them that there's an African American man threatening my life. I mean, throughout this, he was totally calm, and there was nothing at all threatening her life. But Massengale points to this incident as revealing to us about how the system works. And it's not only that we consciously make choices to this, but we just know that if the cops get a call from a white woman and she says, in kind of an hysterical voice, the video is really fascinating. The video is on that site as well. She says, there's an African American man threatening my life. The unwritten rule is that would get the cops' attention. They would believe her, not things would not turn out well for him. Things would not turn out well for him, especially if he were to be angry about this false accusation. Again, in the video, he's totally calm and cool, so that didn't play out the way she may have wanted. But much more detailed in the article, much more obvious in the video. I don't know that I'm doing justice to it, but the point being was that she somehow knew that if she made a phone call to the New York City Police Department saying that a black man was threatening her in Central Park, that it would get a certain response, and that it would get the response that would work in her favor. That's the kind of systemic racism that we're talking about, this kind of deeply embedded stuff that, the word of a white person would obviously be more valued by the authorities or by the police than the word of a black person. I said in my homily over the weekend, with regard to the George Floyd incident, that um, I probably wouldn't have believed it had I not seen the video, um, because it's so outrageous. It just couldn't have happened that way, but it did happen that way. And because there is video proof of it now, I believe it, whereas I may not have believed the word of a black man against the word of the police and the whole police department. So that's that, again, what we call that systemic racism, which makes whiteness more valuable than blackness. I want to quote that article from Massengale because he quotes someone else, essayist Ta-Nehisi Coates, who he says gives the best short description of the complex reality called white supremacy. He says, this is what I mean by systemic racism. Systemic racism. I could call it white supremacy, although I know that white people find that term even more of a stumbling block than white privilege, and of course we do. I mean, that those are unsettling words. But Coates says, and I quote, to describe systemic racism, quote, "It's an age-old system in America which holds that whites should always be ensured that they will not sink to a certain level, and that level is the level occupied by black people." How do we stay above? How do we stay on top? This is uncomfortable stuff because we don't like to admit it, and I should say this too. I mean, I have so long a way to go to looking inside at my own white privilege or white supremacy, call it what you will. That's what's kind of been hard about this week too, because I've wanted to just kind of retreat and to think about it and to process it and to figure it out. But at the same time, life goes on, and you have to have conversations with people, and so it's exhausting, and it is uncomfortable. So my point being, all of us are at maybe different points along that spectrum of self-awareness of where we are, and of how we are or are not, contributing to maintaining or upholding that white system. And for my part, as a leader who's been entrusted with a certain power of office by being an ordained priest, how do I use my leadership in order to work for effective change or policy change? I don't want to get involved in politics. Well, if I don't want to get involved in politics, then nothing's going to change. And so we keep hearing and reminding ourselves that being involved in politics, from a Catholic point of view, as the bishops would say, it's a moral obligation to move these values into the broader society. Um, so, you know, scattered thoughts as we go forward. Um, and that's what's difficult about being separated by COVID these days too, is how do we have a conversation about this? But conversations about it we will have. Um, and again, looking not, you know, beyond, not only within our own house, but beyond, who among our neighbors. You know, Bishop Richard Howell was offered a prayer at the march yesterday. Our neighbor was pastor of Shiloh Temple. Um, you know, what do those neighbors have to? How can we be in conversation with them with regard to us being together to work together toward societal change, or whomever it might be? You know, how do we engage? Brian Massengale, I've got a quote I want to leave you with today from his book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church. But he quotes Dr. Martin Luther King about the struggles and promise of creating a genuinely integrated society. And King wrote, "There is no easy way to create a world where men and women can live together, where each has his own job and house, and where all children receive as much education as their minds can absorb. But if such a world is created in our lifetime, it will be done in the United States by Negroes and white people of goodwill. It will be done by rejecting the racism, the materialism, and violence that has characterized Western civilization, and especially by working toward a world of brotherhood, cooperation, and peace." The language, of course, reflecting that of the time when King wrote this. And Massengale goes on to write, "In other words, social life is made by human beings. The society we live in is the outcome of human choices and decisions. This means that human beings can change things. There is nothing necessary or fated about racial hierarchies or white racial privilege. They are the result of human agency. It does not have to be so. What humans break, divide, and separate, we can, with God's help, also heal, unite, and restore. What is now does not have to be. Therein lies the hope and the challenge." And the fact that we are here, and that we are talking about this, that you are listening to all this blah, blah, blah from me, is a sign in itself of hope going forward. So God bless you. Thanks for tuning in today.